Hi, Jen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
All right, great. Thanks for being here. Um,
Absolutely.
Great. So, Jennifer Wallace, Electrifying Everything, is the title of what we're going to be experiencing. She's a consulting manager at VEIC. What's that stand for?
It used to stand for the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, but like many state-based names, we've just dropped our full title and now we're just an acronym.
Okay, great. We'll call it. We'll leave it at that. Or VEIC. I'm sure there are a lot
Right.
of different ways to pronounce it. Great. The passage of the recent federal and state laws that require us to reach 100% net zero emissions by 2050, and this means there'll be significant changes in infrastructure ahead. So Jennifer, in using her expertise and experience as a consultant for VEIC, will discuss how energy production and distribution are changing with the need for 100% renewable energy, and then most importantly, explore what it means for local city and town governments, and for Cape Ann in particular. So with that, Jen, I'm going to leave it to you.
All right. And I have slides, so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So thanks so much for having me. My name is Jennifer Wallace Brodeur. I work for VEIC. I'm in our consulting division. And VEIC is a nonprofit based in Winooski, Vermont. We've been around for quite a while. We focus on decarbonization. Our bread and butter is energy efficiency implementation. We're a third-party administrator for energy efficiency programs in Vermont, Washington, D.C., and we run or support programs in several other states. But we also have a consulting group that I help lead as the Director of Clean Transportation. And we focus on ways that we can decarbonize buildings and transportation, and sort of what the grid implications of that are. So full disclosure, am a clean transportation expert. So I'm going to talk a little bit about buildings, but if you ask me questions about it, I'm probably going to be stumped. So I'm happy to field questions about transportation. So hopefully there's some people that are interested in that. So what I'm going to do tonight is really sort of give you the big picture about what it means to get to net zero, and sort of the role of electrification in that, and how individuals, households, and the community can make progress towards achieving those net zero goals that have been established in Massachusetts. So one more slide about VEIC. So we've been around since 1986, and we work all across the country with clients to work on clean energy and decarbonization programs, policies, and we do direct work with fleets and businesses as well. So we're really quite busy with all of that work. So just as a little background, I want to just acknowledge there was a decarbonization roadmap conducted for the state of Massachusetts that was released last year. It's a wealth of information, and I did draw a lot of content from that. So I just want to flag it. There's actually a reference to it in the slide deck, and I'm happy to share the slide deck if you want to distribute it to others. But it has a lot of great data about what's going on in Massachusetts and what's the pathways that are needed to get to a net zero future. So here's, I thought it would be good to just sort of take a look at where are the greenhouse gas emissions coming from in Massachusetts? And you can see that transportation is that top bar. In many states, transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a really tough nut to crack. I think most people are aware of that. Buildings are also a significant portion. And you can see that yellow line is electricity. So a lot of states have really focused on electricity generation and how to reduce emissions from that sector. So you're beginning to see that emissions from electricity generation beginning to drop, not just in Massachusetts, but in many other places that have focused on that sector. We actually have a regional program in the Northeast called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that has helped drive that, but there's also a lot of state policies and programs that have contributed to that. So that's important. I'm sort of focusing on that because it's important as you start to decarbonize the electricity sources, then the end uses, you can start to electrify, and that will start to decarbonize vehicles and buildings, which I'll get into a little bit more. So the next slide, Susan Hogue, who wrote me into this, was very kind to, I asked her if there's any data on what the emissions are in Gloucester. And she shared this, I think this, she mentioned that a community volunteer had done this tool, which was developed by DNV, GL, and with MAPSI. But this is a pretty interesting look. So you can see that buildings are actually a pretty significant portion of greenhouse gas emissions in Gloucester. Passenger vehicles are also fairly significant, but thought you might be interested in seeing this. And I can't vouch for how rigorous this is, but it's what I had. So I thought I would share this with you. So you are probably aware that there's been a lot, many years of policy action in the state of Massachusetts to try to get to handle on greenhouse gas reductions. Here's some examples of some recent actions that have been taken. I think Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act was quite significant. It was passed in 2008, and then actually the state was required through legal action to meet those targets, which was really significant. So the state really has to deliver on its targets. There was also Senate Bill 9 passed last year, or this spring actually, that increases protections for environmental justice communities. It establishes new interim goals for emissions reductions, among other things. So that's sort of the newest thing. Massachusetts is also an initial signatory and a leader in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a regional cap and invest program that's focused on the transportation sector and putting a cap on transportation sector emissions, with allowances being auctioned off and generating revenue for clean transportation programs in participating states. Massachusetts has really been leading the way on this program and doing really excellent work to advance that policy in the region. And then, as I mentioned, there are a couple of key strategy documents. The 2050 Decarbonization Roadmap Report is really, as I mentioned, a wealth of information and really lays out a lot of the key strategies that are going to be needed to meet net zero. And this is the net zero determination. I think a lot of people have different definitions of what net zero means, and it can mean different things in different contexts. So I just thought this might be a good level set for what we're talking about in the context of Massachusetts. So there is a net zero determination by letter that was put out by the Baker-Polito administration on Earth Day last year. It sets the legal limit under the Global Warming Solutions Act as a level of statewide greenhouse gas emissions that is equal in quantity to the amount of carbon dioxide or its equivalent that is removed from the atmosphere and stored annually or attributed to the Commonwealth. And then it sets this target. So I think it's that's how Massachusetts is defining net zero. And I think that's important sort of grounding for conversations and communities and at the state level. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the pathways to greenhouse gas reductions. I'm not going to talk about things. There's definitely emissions coming from sources other than buildings and vehicles, but I'm really going to focus on that because that's where we focus as an organization and where you're going to get the majority of your impact. But there are different other things like agriculture and wastewater and a number of other things that generate emissions that are important to note, but I'm not going to reference those tonight. So So I wanted to just, again, sort of make the connection. So how does electrification fit into this? So if you think about, as I mentioned before, the state of Massachusetts is making good progress in reducing emissions from electricity generation. Solar and wind and renewable energy is a big part of that. And since 2005, the Commonwealth's electricity-related emissions have been reduced by about 50%, which is significant. So now what's left is that you've got to start looking at those end uses, and about half of the emissions that must be cut by 2050 come from households and small businesses in the transportation and building sectors. So it's a really significant lift, and it's a really hard thing to do. But as the electricity sector generation gets cleaner, you have basically zero emission alternative to fossil fuels to power buildings, appliances, and vehicles and equipment. So that is why electrification is such a focus of conversation. And there's an interrelation between those two sectors, between electricity generation and then the end uses that are powered by electricity. So if we still had electricity generated by coal, for example, this might be a very different conversation. But as the grid cleans up, electrification becomes the really prominent strategy to meet our net zero goals. So I just wanted to talk through some of the big strategies. These probably aren't new to you, but obviously transportation being the #1 source of emissions in the state, we've got to get our arms around this. And there's two big pillars of strategies. Electrification of vehicles is probably the most powerful pathway because there are so many vehicles on the road. I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that 20%, 7% of total emissions come from light duty vehicles, which are basically personal vehicles. There's just so many cars on the road, and trucks are actually a lot less at 14%. So trucks, rail, and aviation are a lot less. They, as single vehicles, pollute more, but they are just a lot fewer of them on the road. So we really need to make headway in transitioning people from gas-powered vehicles to electric vehicles for personal use. There's also, in the vernacular of my world, fleets. So fleets are anything that's more than one vehicle that's operated by a business or a public entity. So it could be buses, trucks, municipal light-duty vehicles. So if you could, sort of imagine the significance of fleets. So public fleets are ones that we as citizens have a little bit more control over because we can encourage policies that would require that they be electrified. Commercial fleets are a little bit tougher nut to crack, but they can be influenced by mandates and incentives and various other things. But if you're thinking about what you can do as a group of people, really encouraging electrification of public fleets like school buses, transit buses, your municipal vehicles is one thing to be thinking about. Transportation system efficiency is how I sort of categorize the other things. So electric vehicles are a great solution to replace gas-powered vehicles, but there are also other really significant strategies that are focused on reducing vehicle miles traveled and single occupancy driving. So if we can make our system more efficient so people don't have to take a vehicle at all or can share a ride, that's actually a really powerful strategy as well. And so that's where public transportation comes in, bike lanes and sidewalks and safe walking infrastructure, ride sharing, van pooling, and land use. So if people live closer to the things they need to get to, they're less likely to have to get in their car. And so compact development is also a really important piece of the puzzle for this. So this is, as I mentioned, it's really about transportation system efficiency. I like to highlight this because even though my organization and what I do day in and day out is really try to get people to get EVs, they're not the only solution. And if you think about all of the things that contribute to quality of life and people's ability to access their community, for older people that are no longer driving, for people with disabilities, low-income people, all of these strategies are critical. And they're also important strategies to reduce GHGs. So I really like to mention this because it's not just about swapping out one type of car for another. And then if we get into buildings, there's sort of some really big basic pillars here. Weatherization. Weatherization's been around forever. Button up your homes. And energy efficiency. So the things that you're using in your home can be, there's so many ways that we can reduce that. And same for businesses and the commercial sector. And then there's heat pumps, which are electric and can be used for heating and cooling. And I can tell you right now, if I had a heat pump in my house when it's like 90 degrees today, I'd be really happy because I don't have central air here in Burlington, Vermont, and a lot of people in the Northeast don't. So I'm so jealous of all my friends, and my parents have a couple of heat pumps and they are sitting pretty. I can tell you right now, I'm roasting. So anyway, these are some of the ways that we can be looking at making our buildings more efficient and using less energy overall, but also using electricity to power some of the things that we use. So with all of that, I think we all know that there's some great benefits of electrification and, better for the environment, clearly. There's no emissions, so not only is it good for the climate, but it means that people that are in proximity to air pollution, roads and ports and all sorts of things, there's really serious issues with air quality. And if we can reduce the pollutants that are coming from vehicles, that makes a huge difference. And it makes a huge difference in human health and quality of life. Oftentimes with electrification, there's lower operational costs and lifetime savings. This is particularly true in transportation. With fewer moving parts in electric vehicles, you tend to not have as much maintenance costs, and your fuel costs tend to be lower with electric. There's opportunities for resiliency. Batteries in vehicles in particular can be used to support the grid if needed, or power buildings in emergency situations. So there's some real opportunities there. Another big one is energy costs stay local. So in that decarbonization report, it said that Massachusetts residents spend more than $15 billion on energy and energy-related equipment and infrastructure, and most of that money goes out of state. And so with electric, you can keep some of those dollars closer to home, not 100%, but it can keep a little bit more money in the local economy. And then, as I mentioned, there's grid integration opportunities. So electric heat pumps and vehicles can actually help in peak load events. So I'm guessing across New England, for example, where with all this hot weather, our utilities are peaking, and we're paying a lot of money for that electricity. And if you can actually provide some power back from battery sources, such as vehicles or storage or even heat pumps, water heaters, for example, that could help relieve some of the load that's on the grid and can really benefit all of us. Barriers to electrification are significant, though. So even with all these benefits, and I think everybody's probably aware the upfront costs are really significant of all of this technology. And so there's a lot of discussion about ways that you can reduce those upfront costs through incentives and rebates and various programs to support things such as installation of charging infrastructure. So incentives and programs that can put money in the pockets of consumers that are trying to make these changes are really important. A lot of people don't have awareness, and it's not that they maybe don't know these things exist, but they don't know how they perform and have a lot of skepticism about that. It requires people to change how they do things. And people don't like change. I think we can all admit that. And so not only do individuals have to change behavior to get an electric vehicle, or maybe a different kind of appliance, or a different kind of heating system, but so do fleets. So if they don't, if there's a fleet of vehicles that pull up to the gas pump every day, that's not going to happen anymore. They've got to figure out how to charge vehicles, for example. So there's a lot that goes into that as well. There's also just a lot of lack of capacity for change. Sometimes organizations are stretched and they don't have enough people to take on something that requires a big change, and people don't have time in their day to figure it out. So that's an issue too. Supply chains significant, particularly for electric vehicles. There's not enough sometimes to meet demand, and Detroit's been slow to make the models that people are interested in. So that's a significant issue that we don't have a ton of control over, but definitely impacts the market. And then there's, particularly for transportation, the lack of charging infrastructure is a big deal. So if people don't see charging stations or how they might power their vehicle, even if we know that 80% of people charge their EV at home, they don't see it out there in the world, they're going to be skeptical that they're not going to be stranded somewhere. And then I just wanted to mention that there are other considerations. The grid, electrification has a really big, we've really got to change the way we supply electricity in this country to accommodate electrification. And it's a very complicated issue, but I didn't want to just gloss over it. Renewable energy is generated when it's happening, and doesn't always align with when we need electricity. So we've got to have systems of storage that can save that energy and distribute it when we need it. As I mentioned, there's opportunities for new electric technology to send power back to the grid, and that has to be figured out. There's a lot of people working on that, but it's still pretty new and not well tested. But there's a lot of issues with making this work from a grid and utility perspective. So there's, that's just a significant piece of the puzzle, and I wanted to mention that. I can certainly talk a little bit more about that if there's interest. And then last but not least, I just wanted to talk a little bit about here's what we can do as people and as community members. So when you're in the market for a new car or a new appliance, or your furnace blows, or that's the time to really think about, how can I switch out to something that is zero emission? I don't necessarily recommend that you go out and replace a brand new car with an EV. That's wasteful and expensive. But when you're in the market to replace something, that's a great time to think about it and consider electric options at that time. Weatherize your home. It's going to make you warmer and cooler and save you money. So that's been around for quite a while. And then purchasing energy efficient appliances is really important too. And there's the Energy Star program and lots of ways for you to do that, and lots of programs, including Mass Saves, that will help people make those changes. But more importantly, I think there's a lot that the community can do to lead the way. So the community could adopt net zero goals with specific targets for the community itself, and develop a plan to reach those goals. We're working, for example, with the city of Montpelier, Vermont, that set a net zero target a few years ago as the first state capital in the country to do so, and have since then been chipping away at meeting that target. We're working now on a plan for their municipal operations to be net zero by 2030. And so we're really digging into their fleet and to their buildings and wastewater, and what they can do, what types of investments are going to be needed, and what opportunities they have to move in that direction. So having that policy in place and then a plan to implement against it and a concerted effort to reach those targets is, I think, a really important community action. And then that requires somebody to take the reins. So that could be a sustainability director, could be a department head that has the authority to work across divisions within town government. But that's, you definitely need somebody that's has the authority to take some leadership on this and move things forward, because it is usually a cross community effort, and you've got to you have to have buy-in and you have to have leadership for that. There are grants out there. You need somebody that can help write grants to get money into the community to support some of the things you might want to do. As I mentioned, things like electrifying your municipal buildings and vehicles can be a really great lead by example activity. And it's something, as I said, this is public. It's the public domain. Community members can weigh in on this, can say this is important to them, and move forward and encourage the town to move forward with those things. Public EV charging is a really another great way to encourage community members and visitors to purchase EVs if they see it out there and they know it's available to them. That's a great way to send a signal that this is important, and if you need to, there's a place for you to charge. And you can also lead through community events. So many people just need like a ride and drive event for EVs. Like the community can host those, they can partner with the utility to promote these activities, but just having some outreach and education to community members about the importance of some of these actions, and promoting the things the community is doing, as I mentioned, as a lead by example. But that's a really important piece to getting people building awareness about what's out there and what they can do and what programs are available to help them with the transition. So that's another important activity the community can lead. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and thank you all for listening to me, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. That was very great overview. And I encourage people to submit questions. We've got one interesting question about, do you see a conflict between solar farms that are local and farmland or forest covering? Is there a way to avoid that by placing them in parking lots and things like that?
There's a lot embedded in that question. I think that clearly there's often public opposition to siting renewable energy in certain places. And that could include open lands. People don't want to see it, are concerned about it. We all know what the controversies have been around wind. So, you know, one of the things that I think we did here in Vermont was, if a community wanted to have more of a say in the siting of renewable energy, they had to have a plan they had to have an energy plan, and they had to indicate where renewable energy could be sited. And it was really interesting because there was so much opportunity for that that was sort of uncovered through that process. And also what we found was that for the amount of, say, solar we needed, it was actually a very small percentage of the land that was needed for solar panels to achieve some of our goals. So I think that looking at it more holistically rather than site by site might be a good way to go. But I'm always like, if you can do things like rooftop and things that are less intrusive and on land that's already developed, that's a great way, a sort of low-hanging fruit, in my opinion. But I tend to think, you know, look through these things through a political lens, and I know how challenging it can be for some of these things if you're putting it on open land. And yes, there is sometimes that trade-off with like, don't we want this farmland or we want to use it for other things?
So we've had an exchange in the chat between people about the whether or not HVAC can handle larger buildings. And I think it's been resolved in a resounding yes. It's about the scale of the HVAC. So would you agree?
Oh, good. I'm not a buildings person, so I you would not want my answer on that, but it sounds like you've got experts there that maybe can answer that one.
Chat dialogue, I do know that HVAC is used in big commercial buildings. So it's all about the scale and size of the units that are used. And
Yeah.
it does a very good job in this climate. So we don't have to worry about being cold in buildings.
Right.
So are there other questions? I thought the your observation that Vermont handled the issue about siting of solar by encouraging local planning, and that's a good opening for our group to have input about where we might see and recommend to authorities where there might be locations.
Yeah.
Is that something you facilitated?
So in Vermont, we have a process that's called Act 248. So anytime you're going to be siting generation, electric generation, so it could be transmission lines, it could be power plants, it could be renewable energy, you have to go through a public process that is reviewed by our Public Utility Commission to get a permit to build that infrastructure. And so what was happening, particularly with wind and solar, is that a developer would come and say, we want to do turbines in this location. We've had a lot of controversy about mountaintop, in particular, ridgeline turbines. As you can imagine, that's controversial. And then community members or communities would oppose it that were in proximity to it. And basically the legislature passed a bill that said, if you want to participate in this process, you actually have to have an energy plan that identifies where you can site renewable energy within your community in order to participate fully in this permit process. And that was the leverage that was sort of put out there. So it was a balance of saying, you can't just say no to renewable energy. But if you want to participate in this process and oppose it, you've got to have this plan. And so a lot of communities have done that planning, and it has revealed some pretty interesting things, as I mentioned, about how much you actually need to generate the electricity that a community needs or the state needs, and how little land it actually takes. But it was, that was sort of the evolution of that policy.
Okay, well, we're, Candace, maybe you would speak to, this is a good opening to speak to the local planning, Candace, that the CEC will be doing should we be successful with an MVP grant that MAPC and Greg Catamatori and you wrote together. You want to speak to that? Because I think it would be nice for people to know that.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the Gloucester Community Development Department has applied for a municipal vulnerability grant that would allow us to start a process called a Climate Action and Resiliency Plan. And that would have target dates by which the city would get to net zero or to some particular milestone on the way to net zero. And then it would also have specific actions that were designed to implement those targets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how will we get to net zero? Well, we'll do it by electrifying our school bus fleet. We'll do it by adding another wind turbine to the city. We'll do it by community solar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really exciting
That's great.
possibility. And I can't overestimate or can't overemphasize how important it is that the city of Gloucester applied for this and is trying to get ready to do this. It's what all of our climate activists would have hoped. And our city is stepping up to the plate.
Yeah, and just want to mention that Mayor Safadi is in the audience, we understand, and has strongly supported this.
Yes, that's right. And we are very lucky to have a mayor who is a very strong supporter of efforts on climate justice and climate improvement and preservation. So who knows whether we'll get the grant and can move forward. And I think that what this asks of the city is that we need to think of other ways we can handle this process if we don't get that grant. Because there are a lot of other municipalities that are hoping to be the recipient of that grant.
Right.
So that's one of the things our Clean Energy Commission, which I'm involved with, will be focusing some attention on. Our Community Development Department couldn't be better on this topic. It's just been outstanding.
That's so exciting. I'm really happy for you. I'm fingers crossed that you get that because it really sets as I mentioned, it sort of sets the goals and how you're going to get there, and can really rally the community around that. And if you have I know, as I said, we're working on this project in Montpelier, Vermont, and there's a great partnership between the city and the town energy committee, the Montpelier Energy Action Committee. And so there's some very active volunteers that have been really active in the process, and that partnership has been really valuable. So sounds like you maybe have that in the works for your community, and that is a really great way to get the feedback from the community and get the expertise from your local officials, all rowing in the same direction.
Yep. Jennifer, I'm just interested from your experience. In Gloucester, we have a particular concern, which is that some of our affordable, energy possibilities, also impact our fishing industry. And there may be parallels in Vermont with energy solutions that impact the agricultural or the, the tourism or whatever. Do you have communities that have dealt well with finding a way to site energy facilities and still at the same time respect the concerns of, other sources of employment? Because in Gloucester, the fishing industry used to be a major employer. And it's under duress for lots of reasons, but that has meant that our fishing industry is very concerned about things like wind energy. We have already 2 land-based turbines, but there's a lot of offshore turbine development that's being promised now. And it's hard to know as a local energy commission whether we can support that when we know that our own fishing community is very concerned. Would you have any advice or any communities that you think have dealt well with a sort of a competing interest that is worried about clean energy facilities? I
can definitely relate. It's been a very challenging topic for many of our communities. As I mentioned, wind has been, particularly wind turbines, that they need to be high up to get in our state anyway, the ones that are in the mountains are especially good locations, and it has been extremely contentious. And the communities that are, adjacent to those have essentially opposed, and most of the time opposed the turbines. So it is divisive within the environmental community, just to be straight upfront. So there are environmentalists that are opposed to wind energy because of the impact on the landscape. So it's a really challenging issue. All I can say is, one, there's always solutions. And so I think having an open process that engages people at the very front end is really critical. I would say that by impacted communities of all kinds. So people that are low income, people that are in proximity to poor air quality, or and then people that are impacted in terms of their economic well-being and their livelihood. So I think an authentic stakeholder process that is started at the very beginning is probably one of the most powerful things you can do. So even starting those conversations now with facilitation, if you need it, I think is important, but I don't know that there's a silver bullet for this.
No.
It may be that you're looking at other opportunities. Maybe wind is just not something that's going to fly in your community, and you've got to go with a different route. But it's, if you can have an open mind that there may be other ways to achieve your goals, I think that's probably the most important thing. What I like to see, you know, in Vermont, you often see, it's been interesting because solar has actually been a boon for some farmers, because they have, their livelihood is really challenging. As you all know, it's hard to make a living as a farmer. And so the ability to take a portion of their land and make money from solar has been actually helpful to them in terms of being able to keep the farm. And you see things like sheep grazing under solar panels in a lot of places. So it's not that you can't have both uses. You can't grow things, but you can have, you know, animals on land that has solar panels. So there have been some interesting ways that people have sort of tried to do both things. I don't know how you do that. I don't know enough about wind turbines in the ocean. I know that that's an issue, but I don't know if you have ways that you can address their concerns beyond maybe looking to other things.
We certainly have to ask them, and there's already a dialogue that's been started with one of the strongest interest groups. The Fishermen's Wives Association has spoken with the Cape Ann Climate Action Group.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, it's very important to me, the example that you gave in Vermont. My brother and I own a small farm in Bennington, Vermont.
Yeah.
It was our grandparents' farm, and it has a lot of sheep on it, and we're hoping that maybe we can site some solar on it in order to keep the thing going.
Yeah.
So it's a good example of the kind of thing we'd like to translate into a coastal setting and figure out what we can do to make you know, possibly offshore winds, you know, be friendly to the fishing industry and not the opposite of what it needs.
Great.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I think, Jennifer, we're just about at the end of our period, and we answered some great questions and a great overview. So thank you so much for
You're welcome.
giving your time and giving us your expertise. And if you'd like to stay and join a group, you're welcome to do that.
I'm gonna have dinner and try to get cool. I'm roasting hot.
Yes, I can see you're a little warm there.
Like,
yeah, okay.
very hot. But thank you for having me. Please reach out if you have questions. I'm happy to answer things that didn't get addressed in the chat. I know. Thanks, Diane. I need a heat pump. I'm happy to answer questions that you haven't been able to answer amongst yourselves. It sounds like you're a very knowledgeable group, but just please reach out if you have any additional questions. And good luck. I hope you get the grant.
Thank you. Thank you.